EXPO Chicago, the International Exposition for Contemporary and Modern Art. Welcome to our 7th edition. My name is Stephanie Cristello. I'm the Director of Programming here at EXPO Chicago, as well as the Editor-in-Chief of The Scene, Chicago's International Journal for Contemporary and Modern Art. Today, it is my pleasure to welcome you to Dialogues, presented in partnership with the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. Dialogues is a year-round program of provocative artistic discourse, conversations, and symposia with leading artists and curators on the current issues that engage them. Today, we're welcoming you to the 2018 Symposium, which is a curated component of the full Dialogues program, which I had the pleasure of curating and organizing this year. Entitled Present Histories, Art and Design in Chicago, the symposium will trace provocative positions that Chicago's alternative models have shaped and help to continue to impact internationally across fields of art, architecture, design, and culture. Looking at the term present both as an act of portrayal and demonstration, as well as a tense of being current, the symposium will focus on how certain movements founded in the city have been generated, assimilated, and reimagined in our contemporary moment. A special thank you to our partner, the Terra Foundation for American Art, as well as Art Design Chicago, for their generous support in helping to support today's symposium. As the first discussion of the program, author and sociologist of culture, Sarah Thornton, will interview artist Brendan Fernandes, tracing the impact of his work, as well as the role of performance in his practice, which questions positions of power, control, and queering space. Before I open to the panel, I want to briefly introduce our speakers. Brendan Fernandes, born in 1979, Nairobi, Kenya, is an internationally recognized Canadian artist working at the intersection of dance and visual arts. Currently based out of Chicago, Brendan's projects address issues of race, queer cultural migration, protest, and other forms of collective movement. Always looking to create new spaces, new forms of agency, Brendan's projects take on hybrid forms, part ballet, part queer dance hall, part political protest, always rooted in collaboration and fostering solidarity. Brendan is a graduate of the Whitney Independent Study Program, a recipient of the Robert Rauschenberg Fellowship, and his projects have been shown at the Solomon R. Guggenheim Museum in New York, the Museum of Modern Art New York, the Getty Museum in Los Angeles, and the National Gallery of Canada in Ottawa, among many others. He is currently an artist in residence and faculty member at Northwestern University. And he is represented by Monique Meloche Gallery here in Chicago. Brendan also has a solo exhibition currently on view at the DePaul Art Museum entitled The Living Mask, and one of his recent catalogs, titled As One, will be available for a book signing after the panel. Sarah Thornton, who I've had the pleasure of working with almost every year for Dialogues, is a writer and sociologist of culture, formerly the chief correspondent for contemporary art at The Economist. Thornton has written for many other publications, including Art Forum, The Guardian, The New Yorker, and has contributed broadcasts to the BBC, NPR, and ZDF. Her books include 7 Days in the Art World, 33 Artists in 3 Acts, which I'm sure you're all very familiar with. So please join me in giving a very warm welcome to our panelists, Brendan and Sarah. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Stephanie.
Thank you.
It's a great pleasure to be able to interview Brendan. I've known him for a while and admired his work, but never had the opportunity to quiz him in any way, shape, or form. So we decided to call this ready-made, custom-made, foot-made by Brendan Fernandes, and maybe we'll address some of those terms as we go through. One thing I learned that I didn't know before reading about Brendan's work is that ballet started as a bow for Louis XIV.
Yes.
And that is a part of the backstory to Révérence, in which we are now engulfed. And tell us a bit about the history of ballet and how it informs your work.
So I'm a former ballet dancer. My family is Kenyan, so when we left Kenya to move to Canada, I started to dance. My parents put me in a ballet class because there was a free class for immigrant kids, and that's how I started. And I moved up into the ranks and became a dancer, and I just wanted to be a dancer as a young child. But the history of ballet is that ballet began as a Baroque bowing gesture that Louis XIV, choreographed or made his court perform for him. And so those acts became then a dance form, and then through that dance form it became the dance of the kings. And so ballet as we know it now is sort of informed through the Russian court. But it began in the court of Louis XIV as a way to bow. So the positions, first, second, third, fourth, fifth, and sixth, were all bowing gestures. So, and the way to also bow to the king through hierarchies, the lower you are is the kind of the class system, but also to present the foot. The foot was the way to kind of, so it's become a very aestheticized, characterization of ballet is the foot. And in my work, I think about foot fetish a lot. Because as a young dancer, my feet were never the feet that were perfect or good enough for myself. And we'll talk about that. The desired bodied, the mastered bodied. That a ballet dancer is. We look like we're in effortless modes, but we're in such great moments of fortitude and endurance. There's a lot of power to the form of dance.
Now, you also discuss dance of all forms as a kind of manual labor, as work and service. Can you elaborate on how that informs your work?
I think because for me, in the performance mode, also the perspective, we have the theater space, and you see the dancer on stage. You don't hear them breathe. You don't hear them sweat. You don't smell them. Or you don't see them sweating. You don't hear them fatigue or gasp. So there's this kind of idea of proximity as well that I'm curious about, because when we're in those modes, we've trained our bodies to do things in such specific kind of ways that it's about effortlessness. But at the same time, I think about how we dehumanize that, and then when we have the proximity, there's a question of the humanness. There is a physical body doing this. Dancers, I also always say, we're artists, but we're also athletes. And that's a really important thing for me, to kind of question the artistry, the romanticization of that body, but also the athleticism, the physicality that we also endure. So that's the labor.
Yeah. Now, stillness is an important part, an important form for you in particular, for dance, perhaps to a lesser degree, where movement tends to be the emphasis. What does stillness mean to you?
So stillness, going back to labor, stillness for me is, still an active space. I think about it, specifically with, the core in a ballet company. So the core being, in the classical ballet system, there is a core dancer, there's a soloist, and there's a principal. Core dancers will do more, sort of like in Swan Lake, can stand in a position for a long period of time while the swan moves. So the idea of moving, meaning that there's an active body, but if you're even in stillness, you're still active. Your body is still laboring. It's still, if I'm holding my hand like this for 45 minutes, it's still active, it's still laboring. So thinking about labor through stillness, but also, for dancers, we're always told to move. We're always having to move. So the idea to even stop is a question of authority, of power, of allowance. How are we activating our own bodies or taking on our own agencies in that space of stillness as well?
I mean, certainly as someone who does yoga, I'm a fidgeter, and I find it very hard to stay still.
No, and I think for me, I make my dancers do things that I find challenging. I can't stay still. I'm constantly on the go, and so just to stop, to take that time is also a moment of contemplation, a moment of questioning. So it's because we're always kind of like in this go mode. That's a capitalist mode. To keep on going. If you're not, I think about Andre Lepecki, who said in his book Exhausting Dance that there is no dance if you're not moving, and I disagree to that. But I think in that mentality that to be moving means we're being efficient.
So, you have referred to yourself as a broken, older, former dancer.
That was a secret between us.
No, it's in print. And you distinguish a former dancer from an ex-dancer, which I think is interesting.
That was a
but I'm
therapist.
wondering if you could just break down every part of that phrase, broken, older, former dancer.
Broken in the sense that, I left the ballet world because at the age of 22, after like dancing and having this moment of like, I'm going to be a dancer, I will dance in a company, and I put all this time, effort, labor, physically, mentally into the process, I tore my hamstring. And even within, the dance world, like there was other situations, like they never liked my feet. The dance world was always like, your feet are too flat, And so, broken physically, mentally, I left at 22, and I was like, I'm not going to do dance anymore. And I actually went on and did my master's program, and in that program, I never told anyone I did dance because it was like this kind of like trauma. I was like, I just don't like you anymore. But we still were kind of friends in a certain way. When I moved to New York, I started seeing ballet again, watching it. I never took a class, but then I started to realize I kind of want to work with dance again. So I started to bring dancers back into my practice. In that moment, I started to realize that I was older, my body doesn't do things the same way. And then I started to think about myself, am I a dancer? Can I still be a dancer? And I started to think about like, youth in the dance world is such a virtue. An older dancer is kind of like, we have such short-lived careers. Mine ended at a very short period, but I started to think about these notions of broken, former, injured, all of these kinds of things. And I also always just say to people, I am an ex-dancer. And I felt there was a kind of negativity to that notion of ex. I say former, but in it, like I also realized I still have it in me. Like I know the way I carry myself. I know the way that I'm on a dance floor. There's still a moment. And so full circle, coming back to the way I make work now, I still have found a way to include the art and, have dance still in my life. So we broke up, but we're back together again.
That sounds great. Going on the topic of age, the ballerinas around us are, I don't know, 17,
There's ballerinas
18.
around us? I don't see anything.
I hope I'm not. What is the lifespan of a professional dancer nowadays? Like, what is old?
Well, the thing also with dancers now, dancers have become so physically kind of engineered. Like, I couldn't be a dancer right now if not at my age, if I was a young dancer, because the way I train, the way it was just so different. Like, as I say, they're athletes, it's about the physicality. So they're working out, they're doing Pilates after class, so there is more of a longevity. We're also learning how to take care of our bodies. When I was a dancer, it wasn't about that. It was like over-rotate your hips, dance on this floor. Like, when a lot of my work deals with the dance floor as an architectural space that supports our bodies, but also as a space of resistance. So, when I talk to my dancers, we always talk about like, how does the floor penetrate the body? How does the floor hit the body? You never want to dance on a concrete floor because that's going to hurt the body. So we always think about like the sprung floors. I think about that resistance of a sprung floor as something that allows the body to endure, but also allows the body to find a space of resistance, so like a political notion. So in my work, I think about resistance to the dance floor, and I also think about this notion of standing up. So in this piece here, which I kind of didn't mention, that's the foot device I used as a young dancer to bind my foot to give me the turnout and the arch. And so, I'm cramping right now.
Just thinking about it.
And yeah, so this piece is an endurance piece where I'm trying to, after 15 years out of the dance world, putting on the foot stretcher that I used to use as a child or a young man, and then trying to, as I'm holding it, trying to stand up. And there's it's my first solo, I say, coming back to dance. And there's a solo, it should be spectacle, there should be jumps and turns, and it's a slow moment of like contemplation, stillness, breathing, and I'm just mentally, to a 3-hour performance, trying to stand up. I have the authority and power to let go and just stand up. But there's this thing as dancers that we have this dedication and devotion that we won't stop, And so there's this thing where I'm just like, I'm pushing through it. And it's actually excruciating because that's my torn hamstring and my bad foot. And it just sort of sends this pain all up my back into my sciatic nerve. So it's like really
Masochistic?
Well, yeah, more masochistic.
I'm just wondering.
No, and I was gonna say the most bizarre part of it is when people watch me, I forget the pain,
Oh, that's interesting.
and then when the audience leaves, I start to endure the pain again. And for me, there's this thing that as dancers too, I remember as a young boy dancing in this one studio that was 20. It was called a fishbowl. It was 360 degrees of glass. And even though you're rehearsing, just because you're being watched, you just kind of give a little bit more. So when eyes are on you, there's a certain kind of thing of like. So I'm also curious about the mastery and form of ballet, but also the kind of masochistic qualities that we also take on. We have our own fetishes. Like as I said, I have foot fetish in ballet. Like I'm looking at dancers' feet all the time because I didn't have those desired feet, but I always look at dancers' feet for arches.
And your thoughts on toe shoes in particular?
Well, point shoes are
Point shoes, I should say.
toe shoes, point shoes are definitely a form. I feel like women in the ballet work so much harder than males.
Right.
I think about like a ballet like Swan Lake, and the core is made to dance in unison and work with such like intense footwork, but they all have to be perfectly the same at the same time. And so I'm really curious about and I have friends who dance with American Ballet Theater, and they say when they're in the Met season, they use 10 pairs of shoes each a week. Because you're putting all your fortitude onto your toe, and so the shank of the shoe just breaks eventually. So they need 10 pairs a week.
So my next question is actually about gender and strength. And you've already touched upon it, but I mean, there's a whole history to the kind of waif-like ballerina who appears to be incredibly frail and fainty. You tend to go for more power in your female dancers. Tell us, when do you choose women? When do you choose men? Trans dancers. How does gender affect the choices you make when developing a performance?
So I'll say this one thing. Ballet is very structured in a heteronormative binary history. So I'm trying to question those things in the kind of idea of ballet. Like even just thinking about gender and race. For example, Misty Copeland is our first principal dancer of color in the history of ballet. Ballet, as we said, started in the court of Louis XIV. So it's very much a very specific kind of binary that I'm trying to challenge and critique. Within it, I'm also thinking about, the dancer that trains and learns ballet is such a specific kind of body. Like they're technically trained. So when I work with the ballet dancers, it's very different than working with contemporary dancers or modern dancers. Modern is another form of technical bodies too, but contemporary can improvise and so forth. So when I work with dancers and the pieces are more interpretive or have more improvised and I want contemporary bodies, I just put out calls that are very neutral. So I'll give the call and I'll say what the piece is about, but when I go to the moment where it's like, asking for the body, I'll say something like, I'm looking for strong and otherwise authoritative bodies. And if you self-identify under that call, then you are part of the piece. And so I'm trying to, change the kind of relationship of how we look at bodies. And again, someone said to me, you always work with such beautiful bodies. Beauty in quotation marks, but again, we're athletes. Our bodies are constantly, these dancers here probably dance 8 hours a day. And then if you're in a company, you're dancing even more. So the training process is like, you have to be that kind of body. Mm-hmm. So it's not that I'm picking the quote unquote aestheticized, beautiful body. It's because this is what happens when you're dancing.
It's interesting you use the term authoritative because when it's your performance, you're the author of the performance, but presumably you're looking for a degree of self-possession and confidence in your dancer. What do you mean by authoritative when you're using it in that way? It's intriguing.
I want it to be I want it to be like a self-identifier that I as a dancer have the power as well to make that choice. That I can self-identify whether my body is, however I feel my body is, I'm going to self-choose instead of it being upon me. Because, when you do normal calls, it'll give you like height, even eye color of hair. Like it's like, especially like they,
Leg length.
leg length. Certain companies, for sure, they're just known for having ladies who have longer legs because that's what Balanchine wanted. So I'm trying to break down those things and ask people to self-identify and to find agency. For me, it's about dancers finding agency. I always was just told how to dance or what to do, and for me, in this role of artist, choreographer, maker, thinker, I am very much aware of my dancers. We're always in a collaborative, generative space where we have conversations because I was never given that. And so I asked them, what makes you feel comfortable? Stop when you need to stop. Take a break when you need to. And so it's always in that space of collaboration.
Mm-hmm. Sweet. You talk a lot about how your work queers different spaces, dances, environments, and issues. Can you talk a little bit about queering?
So queering for me is not just about gender and sexuality. It's about self-identifying, self-changing, but also a space that for me questions resistance, movement, but also the space of questioning a safe space. So kind of utopian idea of what is the safe space. So in a lot of my recent work, I've been thinking about the club, the dance club as that space of sanctuary, of freedom. Where can we find social solidarity, a critical mass? And so even within the ballet company, I feel there's this moment where the core dancers move to each other. They move in unison. Bodies moving in unison, for me, is so powerful because you also aren't necessarily watching each other. We're just feeling each other in a certain way, and it just sort of happens. And I think that's such an important, beautiful moment in dance. And in the dance club, we're doing that. And for me, when I, post ballet class or the club for me is a really important place that has given me my queer identity, has allowed me to be free and be who I am. And so I've been thinking a lot about that and positing Pulse Orlando when that space was encountered and we had that tragedy, and how has that changed the space that we're calling safe. So for me, it's also, what is that space? I don't know what it is. So in my work, I'll create dance floors, sculptural devices that the dancers will dance on, and it becomes a platform for performance. It becomes a place to gather. So the space itself is constantly reinvented, and that for me is queering the space, the reinvention of the space to be so many different things. There is no set definition of that space.
And Brendan referred to the terrible tragedy of 49 people being shot in that Orlando dance club called Pulse, and I'm going to show you images from works that were inspired by that incident. It's funny, I did my PhD on dance clubs and raves. I don't know if you know that.
I did not know that.
Yeah, and so the whole idea that these spaces were important sanctuaries for the gay community is, well, it rings so true, and also historically was even more important. Prior to the internet, prior to gay marriage, prior to being able to walk down the street hand in hand, clubs were really the only place where gay people could be themselves.
Yeah, and I also think about cruising culture as a form of choreography, right? The body language, the way we read body language is a form of choreography. In my work, I also think about our everyday choreography. We walk in the art fair in a certain way. For me, this is no different than Louis XIV's court. There's a hierarchy, and so even having the dancers kind of bowing to the art object or bowing to you, it's a form of court. It's a hierarchy. It's a social structure.
Yeah. I love it. Cruising as choreography. Now, white masks appear in your work a fair amount. White masks with African motifs, generally. This is an older piece, and I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about the use of the mask.
So a lot of my earlier work looked, as I said, I put away dance. Dance was put away, and I started to think about, my post-colonial identity, my identity as a Kenyan Indian who then immigrated to Canada, and the notion of the mask as, a moniker or a device that can hide identity or create identity. So even in the performance mode when I'm dancing, I take on a new identity. West African masquerade, which I kind of conflate between ballet and ballet and the masquerade, is about taking on a new form. When you put on the mask, you become a new creature. So in this piece in particular, I was thinking about masks being sold on Canal Street, the kind of idea of the commodity versus the souvenir versus the artifact. And I started to buy this mask in particular and recreate it in a white resin and then put it onto the deer, because and this is a white cotton-tailed North American deer, so a North American species. So this kind of quote-unquote African object, when it's put on top of the white cotton-tailed deer decoy, so a plastic deer that's used in the hunting experience to kill a real deer, they become something different. So it's again a queering. It's a hybridity, but it's also about a queering. So I use the kind of, and then whiteness to kind of, posit Fanon and the idea of colonial histories and those histories of violence and trauma as well.
Yeah, the Frantz Fanon
For
famous text. I'm very intrigued by your use of color in the work, particularly your sensitivity to skin. And I'm wondering, this is, I believe, one of the works inspired, I don't know if that's the right word to use, but...
Posited through Orlando, yeah.
Yeah,
there was an exhibition at Recess in New York where I started thinking through call and response. As a form to create choreography through. So the dancers have this space, again, a queering space, so they have these flesh tone panels that have rubber on the bottoms that they can use on the floor to kind of dance on, because the floor in this space is all concrete. And then every time they come into the space, they reconfigure the space, so it's always changing, and then they reinvent a way to perform in it. And part of a lot of the choreography was a lot of like resuscitation, but through the resuscitation, they also would have these kind of like beats, where they would beat on the wall, calling to each other. And sometimes, they were like, I can't hear it. We didn't hear the call. So the call is to gather. The call is to bring them together, to separate. They have different cues and tasks within the calls. But in that, sometimes they didn't hear each other. And they were like, the person never came. They didn't hear my call. But I was like, sometimes we don't get heard. And that also then, reminds me of Pulse Orlando, when something isn't heard, or we're, even as an artist, like my role, my responsibility is to create conversation, to create dialogue, to disseminate, but sometimes I'm not heard. But in this political moment, especially now, it is my job, and that's what I'm kind of pushing through. So a lot of my work in the choreography is about thinking about an idea, a notion, and having a call and response. So the dancers are working with each other.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And in my experience of your work, and also just having looked at a lot of the photography, you usually have a spectrum of ethnic identities, not segregated identities. Would that be the case?
Yeah, and again, I don't want to be woke about it, but I want to have diverse bodies, but I put these calls out where I'm like, you self-identify, and for some reason I get these most amazing people that just want to be part of it, and it just happens. I'm obviously aware, and it's part of the work, but I don't want to be I part of these calls, these open monikers, and I'm just like, we self-define and we come together.
Awesome. This is another piece called Free Fall from 2017, where you're working through some of your thoughts and feelings about the Pulse disco tragedy in Orlando. Here it looks like a kind of rehearsal of death. There's death in traditional ballet,
And death, but also falls, right? So these dancers are falling, and part of the choreography was to choreograph a fall, that they fall to the ground, but also don't hurt their bodies. So how do we fall? So we start to crumble, you break down the body, and then you fall and you kind of land. So it looks like a fall, but it isn't. And in ballet or in any kind of dance form on stage, you can never fall. Like if you slip, it's like, oh my God, I always think about, the sequence in La Bayadere where all the girls, the lady dancers do arabesques. And I remember being told as a young dancer, if a dancer ever puts her foot down in that sequence, it's just not good. It's just not good. But the idea of also falling, and so I thought about the fallen body in the Pulse Orlando. 49 people fell to the ground in the nightclub and didn't get up. So in this piece, we throw a party. It's a political dance party, and in that moment, I have dancers. This is at the Getty. This is early on in the night. We're playing music, and then I get the DJ to stop the music 49 times, and when they stop, there's a sort of a sound cue that gives the dancers a moment to be like, okay, time to fall, and then they they perform that choreographed fall, and they all lay on these platforms and just stay there in silence, in stillness for a period of time, and then the music starts up again, and then they start to dance. So it's like the idea again of the political resistance, like I'm standing up. And for me, it's such a vulnerable piece, but at the same time, it's so empowering. And eventually, the choreography of falling becomes learned to the audience. And at the end of this night, we had 5,000 people at the Getty, and at the last fall, all 5,000 people fell, and we all laid on the floor together. And it was this moment of just like, again, the critical mass, that idea of social solidarity, and then we all stood up. And it was just like, whew. You know, like,
Amazing.
I'm having some moments now. Thank you. So, yeah.
I'd like to experience that. Community is defined in a very broad way in your work, partly because many of the performances are interactive, that example included, but also when people are arriving into this room, our ballerinas here were bowing at them, for them, in their vicinity, and there were, reactions to be had. Can you tell us a little bit about this work, and your use of things other than the body?
So I use a lot of text, I use a lot of sculpture. I feel that, that's where the intersection of visual arts and dance comes into my work, where I use physical bodies moving, but there's always a collaboration with the visual arts in terms of like a film or a sculpture. This piece in particular, is about, working with a window sign painter who would paint union sign, like protest placard signs that would kind of talk about collectivity, and then I'd have dancers move in unison and wash the windows with their bodies. So it was like the kind of question of labor again. And for me, we is a space of social solidarity, a space of collective, collectivity. And as I said, that my work is, to think about the idea of bringing bodies together, to move as one, to kind of question that political space. How do we come and gather to be all the same thinkers? Because that's, for me, is the socialist perspective that I engage in my work, to bring people to think together, to make that social space for everyone. Inclusivity, generosity, kindness.
Tell us about sculpture, too, because, of course, we're in the midst of living sculpture, in one sense of the word, but you also create sculpture in the traditional sense, too.
Yep.
How does that work for you? How do you think that through?
So as an artist, I think my work is process-based. My work is based on ideas, and in that, then the way it gets formulated or manifest takes on many forms. So, as a young dancer, also I was attending art school at the same time. And I remember, I'm doing a bronze casting residency next year at my alma mater in Toronto, York University. And it was funny, I was walking in the studio, because I remember there was the dance studio on the first floor, and on the other side of the first floor was the sculpture studio, and I'd all be running back and forth. So for me, it's like my second nature to kind of work in this way, to kind of think in these ways. But I think that the collaboration of dance and visual arts is something that has happened. We have like Judson Church, and we have artists like Yvonne Rainer, but the kind of, Trisha Brown, the collaboration has always been there. But I think what I'm playing with that kind of makes it a little bit like cheeky is the kind of etiquettes, the kind of rules. And so, when I do my performances, people will say is it performance art or is it dance? And that's queering as well. It's both, it's all of them. And for me, that's the kind of funny place that it's non-defined. I never want to define it,
Mm-hmm.
so it plays in both spaces.
I'm really intrigued by this notational form on the right. And of course, one of the things you talk about in relationship to your work is the loss of this ephemeral form of dance. And I don't know, is this Le Bon notation? No, this is your own?
No, this is so dance doesn't have a formal language, right? We've tried to find ways to find a language to choreograph and to remember dance. We use the camera now, right? The camera is the device that allows us to re-perform or to kind of notate. But these are drawings by Louis XIV. These were drawings that Louis XIV did that were his way of like noting choreography. We have no way to understand it or perform it. But for me, that's also an interesting space. So sometimes I give my dancers the drawing, and then I'm like, let's make a dance out of it. Like, how do we interpret it? So again, it's that kind of like, non-defined space. And then my notation there is one of my calls for dancers. So looking for bodies that are invisible, other than small, who self-define, to contract and release, to act out, if interested, inquire within. And it's playing also like, in a tongue-in-cheek way on like, to contract and release is the formal, the formal way of Martha Graham. You contract your muscles and then you release. But it's also playing on a cruising culture as well. There's a queering to that call as well.
And I mean, it reads like a poem, really, right? And inquire within.
Within, yes.
Yeah.
For sure.
I'm scooting on in the interest of time. I wanted to ask you about works on paper. There are 7 exquisite, unique works on paper on the DePaul booth down there.
Please go see it.
And they're actually right here.
Oh, there we go.
And so, 2 dimensions, that must be a struggle.
As I said, for me, it feels just, part of the way I work is that there's always, I made prints, I made drawings as a child, as in high school. I've always engaged in all of it. And I think one of the things was like my struggle as a young dancer and a young artist was like, how do I do both of them? Because I was always told you have to choose one or the other. And so that's why I said foot circle, I feel like I'm pretty spoiled because I get to do both now. Like I'm still dancing, like, and I find that really empowering in the way that I'm doing it. But yeah, these pieces are looking at West African masquerade masks and looking at reinstating the body through the colonial body. The French colonized West Africa, took away those objects. When we took them when they were taken out of their place of origin and placed in the museum, we took away their bodies. So in this newer work, I'm also looking at how the ballet body, as a French form of civilized dance, can reinstate a body to these objects. And that kind of conflation also creates like a tension, but also a coming together. So it's also not necessarily just about that negative space. It's also about creating a positive space of newness.
Now, I do want to open it up to questions from the audience, but I wondered, as a last question from me, whether you'd talk about your relationship to beauty, because it seems to me, whatever you make there is incredibly beautiful, in new ways and old traditional ways too.
That's an interesting question, because I definitely think about aesthetics. I definitely think about even the aesthetics of my body language when I move, or the way that I, perform myself in my everyday. And I think about it through beauty, through even like dance. Dance is something that's really, ballet is really beautiful. Like, when I watch it, I'm still romanticized by the body that's moving in such a specific way. So I think it's something that's ingrained in me, but I'm also using it as a way to inform and still think about like a political agency. So when I'm working with my dancers and they're doing beautiful acts of fortitude, it's also, questioning about their agency, their labor, their value as an artist, value as a person, all of that I think is part of it. So I think I'm conflating beauty into a question of power as well.
Nice. Do we have any questions from the audience? Yes, right there.
I just want to say first, thanks to the dancers for doing such an amazing job. You guys were amazing.
I actually came in, if there was an introduction, I didn't hear about the dancers. Could you actually tell us where they're from and
Do you guys want to say where you're from? Yeah.
I can't get up. Oh.
Okay, we're all trainees at the Joffrey Academy of Dance. Yeah. I'm Greta.
I'm Lauren.
I'm Priyana.
I'm Anna.
I'm Caitlin.
I'm Kat.
I'm Faith.
And I'm Jessica.
And thank you again, guys. You guys were amazing. And, you know, at the same time, like, you guys were, like, laboring up there. So if you guys have questions for them about how they feel or what was going on for them in that process. But what they were doing was, and initially, I'm questioning the notion of the bow. As I said, a bow was the way that Louis XIV choreographed and constructed his court to act towards him. So, and those were the foundations of ballet. And so in the beginning of the performance, they're bowing to the audience. But then I'm also thinking about the bow at the end of a performance and how that's when we as dancers get acknowledged. So the kind of idea that you can bow to somebody and give your body to them, but at the end of a dance performance, we bow and we ask for your applause. So you also were participants in the piece, and that's something that happens in a lot of my work. My audience is also asked to participate. So you guys were starting to clap, and you're like, what are they doing? And then they come back and bow to you. So it's this back and forth of the bowing gesture.
And this piece is called Révérence, or Reverence in French, and it was first performed in Toronto?
It was first performed at the Sculpture Center at the Rainbow, in the Rainbow Room up Rockefeller Center with the American Ballet Theater.
Okay.
And so it was this kind of like pomp and circumstance space, and then you have these dancers, like, as you enter the space, you know, and we had 18 dancers, and as they came, you had this, like, you know, cascade of dancers all falling to you, almost like when you enter the space, and then they would get up, and then when you walked, so we had this, like, it was a sort of entryway. When you entered, they would bow, but then they start to bow to you, or just, like, lay on the floor in this deep swan dive. And so, yeah, and we talked about also, like, you know, the authority that they have in it. You know, they're bowing to you, but there's a playfulness where I was like, you know, people might stay away. So, like, you know, you take your power as a dancer and put it forward. And you guys found that happen, right? Yes, I kind of see a hand there.
Hi, so just thinking about cruising, could you just talk a little bit about your use of architectural forms and perhaps how they inform desire? Just thinking about maybe the Graham Foundation show.
Okay, for the Graham, I did a show recently at the Graham Foundation, and I was thinking about, and there's three of the devices on display at Monique Meloche's booth, which will be activated daily by another Joffrey Academy trainee. And I've been thinking about the idea of, like, desire, mastery of form. So almost thinking about the foot device that I used as a young boy, but taking it to make a full body one. So there's one of the pieces is called arms in fourth, legs in fifth. And so they have to perform that position and hold it in perfection for a long period of time. And this device acts as a tool. It's almost like, you know, a BDSM tool, but it's kind of also this kind of, I'd say, it's like there's a furniture intimacy, because wherever the body, like, touches, there's, like, a piece of leather that kind of supports and helps it kind of stay in that position for a little bit longer. So I'm thinking about, you know, the archetype of the body that is, you know, desired and questioned in ballet, and how do these devices support it to kind of stay in that position for as long as possible. So obviously, labor is something that I think about through endurance, and then fatigue, and then failure. So in that space, when they fail, and they have to, quote unquote, fail, have to release themselves out of that device, then they can go and they have freedom to kind of stretch and allow themselves to release and then come back into the device.
Other thoughts, comments, questions?
Oh,
great.
hi.
Sorry. Hey, Kimberly.
I was curious if you could talk a little bit more about documentation and also some of the technical challenges of recording and reaching out. Like, what are some of the technologies that you're interested in right now, or things that you're seeing within the dance world?
For sure. As I said, you know, the camera is a lens that allows us to document, and then it gives us the way to re-perform. Like, I'm sure when you guys dance, like, you watch videos of, and I sent you guys videos, like, duh. So yeah, that's the way that, so the camera and digital media in that way is really important for re-performing and archiving. So, and even in my own process, like, I will record everything and be like, you know, bow number 1, this is what it looks like, just so I can also remember. But I've been using technology in some of my newer works. I just, in a couple weeks, 2 weeks, next week, I'm going to open a show at the Musée des Beaux-Arts in Montreal, and I've been working with ballet and dance through virtual reality. But then I also use, like, you know, things where I choreograph through Snapchat. I did a piece at the MCA where I gave my group, my dancers, you know, they had their phones, and then I would send them like tasks and choreographic scores through Snapchat. And so also the everyday choreography of like holding the phone or swiping like became part of the dance. And so you'd see them all moving in unison because I told them to do this one gesture, and then their phones would all buzz, and then they kind of would break out and be like, and then start to dance. And so I'm playing with those kinds of technologies as well in the form of, in my dance, yeah. So kind of more analog, but then also thinking about it through, you know, like virtual reality. I've also done things where I'll tell my audience how to find the dance through text messaging. So I'll send like a group text if you sign up for it. Then I'll also write like poetic, like poems, and then they'll get fragments, and then it'll be like, okay, we're meeting here today, come gather. And so we kind of gather through that critical mass through like that kind of form of technology. Yes?
You talked about being at school and running from the sculpture studio to the dance studio, and that's just a beautiful image. So I'm wondering, like, what do you do on a daily basis? Like, what spaces are you moving in between?
Sure. And just to note about that image of me running from the sculpture studio, I was a bronze caster. So I'd wear this like crazy like jumpsuit with a big zipper, and underneath it I'd have my leotard and my tights, and then I would like zip it out and then jump, dance, and then come be like, because in bronze casting it was lost wax process, so I had to like dip my piece in the ceramic. So I would like, in our break, like zip back on my jumpsuit and then run to the slurry and like dip it and then come back. So it was like a funny dance, and it's interesting because I'm kind of taking that idea and that image to the piece at my alma mater, where I'll be right beside that dance studio, the fishbowl that I talked about, and at in that same bronze casting space. And I'm like, how does this become a project? We'll see. Stay tuned. But like my everyday, my space, it's, you know, I have to really think about, you know, it's kind of varies, you know. I'm teach, so it's I'm taking like, you know, dance class myself, you know. So it kind of varies. A lot of it spends in an airport, unfortunately, these days. So I think about like, how do I self-care in the airport? How do I get my work done in the airport? Am I sleeping enough? Those are all questions. I really question self-care, and like, you know, for all of, you know, these dancers also, I want them to also remember that, you know, you have to take care of yourselves. You know, I thought I was going to be invincible, you know, and it didn't always work, but you guys, you know, are aware of that. And so I become that way where, you know, the idea of self-care is really important.
We have a question right here.
I thought it was really interesting how you talked about like the living sculpture and how sculpture and sort of performance art is like complementary work. And it seems like you followed the dance path first, and then you sort of started doing sculpture later in grad. I'm just interested in how was sculpture sort of a way for you to connect again with dance, because you talked about being a former dancer, and I'm a sculptor and I have a dance background, so I found that particularly interesting.
Yeah, and I think that, you know, I always had the dance path, but as I said, I was working in tandem, sculpture, you know, and dancing. So for me, it always was a thing that I did at the same time. My first sculpture I remember in college was called Contraction. Because I was like thinking about Martha Graham, you know, like, and what Martha Graham was doing. And, you know, the pieces here are in second position, fourth in passe. So they're all like, you know, responding to my lived experience, you know, the muscle memory, the trauma, whatever that my body has gone through and lived through is also how I express through movement, but also through sculpture.
Other comments or questions? Is there someone back there? No. Okay.
We good?
Great.
Thank you. We have another question?
We do have one. Okay.
How long do I plan to stay
Do
in
you
Chicago?
consider yourself a Chicago artist, or
Yeah,
did
I'm a
you-
Chicago artist. I just bought a home here. I
Awesome.
live here. This is home. Chicago has welcomed me so graciously. And the thing is, like, you know, for me, it's just a good time to be here. I feel welcomed. I feel I found community in so many ways. And so, yeah, I'm in Chicago.
It's interesting to find a home.
Yeah, and that's something I question all the time.
You were, I believe, the Okay, so you're Goan, right? Which is why you have a strange Portuguese surname, Fernandes, despite being Indian. But you're from the Goan part of India, where the Portuguese invaded, I guess, or did a lot of commerce. And so then the family lived for 5 generations in Kenya, and you were the first member of your family to go back to India.
Yeah. So when I went to India for an art fair, my parents were like, "What's it like there?" And I was like, they're like, it was like these questions, because physically we look like Indians, but we also are Africans, and so even in that question of identity, it's like, who am I? It's like, I'm the dancer, I'm the Indian, I'm the Kenyan, I'm the punk rocker kid from Toronto who ran again from the ballet studio also to the punk club to listen to Minor Threat and Fugazi. It's all of those things, subculture, cultural ethnicity. It's the makeup of who I am. So yeah, and it changes. Now I'm a Chicago artist. The Chicago identity. Representing.
Any last comments or questions?
If there are no further questions, I just wanted to thank both of our panelists for being here. Let's give them a round of applause.
Thank you, Brendan.
And the amazing dancers from the Joffrey Ballet, another round.
A final bow, perhaps?
A bow, please.
Our ladies?
A bow from all.